You may recall that before Pesach and before we took our break, we were talking about the Rambam in Perek Hey, Mehilchos Yesodei HaTorah Halacha Vav, Chole Sha'ovar v'nisrape b'avodah zorah, or Gilui Arayos, or Shvichas Damim, and the issue of whether or not a person who was compelled to violate one of the three, and he was chayiv in Kiddush Hashem, and instead of Yeharg Val Yavor, he was over, and under these very difficult conditions of ones, he violated Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim, or Avodah Zarah. And the Rambam says that Bezdin Manishino So B'Onish Haroylo, that he will be punished. And we suggested in the name of Reb Chaim that the punishment would not be Misa or Malchus, but rather Malchus Mardus or Nidu or Shamta, V'lo Onish Shel Misa U'Malchus. Because even though he's capable of making that decision, whether or not he should avail himself of Gilui Arayos, Avodah Zarah, Shvichas Damim, but nevertheless, he was onus. Even though the onus was not external to him, it was internal, but that still is an onus. And therefore, he cannot be put to death for a capital crime, and not even Malchus. However, the Rambam's language is onshim oso bezdin onish haroylo. How do you interpret those words haroylo? Reb Chaim understood that the Rambam doesn't say bezdin malkin o memisin oso. He only says onish haroylo. Roylo means he deserves to be punished. He was misrape. He made that decision. He did not overcome his desire to live for the sake of Yeharg Val Yav. Okay, but he was still an onus. It was not a deliberate decision on his part, and therefore, Bezdin Manishin or so onish haroylo, but that means some sort of other onish. However, we would like to suggest a different pshat in the Rambam. Let's open up the Daf Ayin Dalid Amud Beis, and we will see the sugya of Esther. And the Gemara asks the following question: For Esther Farhesia Havi. So this you'll see on Daf Ayin Dalid Amud Beis, approximately 1/3 down the page, a little bit more. And the Gemara is troubled by the fact that Esther allowed herself to have a relationship with Achashverosh. And the Gemara says that this is a problem for Farhesia, because all the Jews in Shushan knew that she was going to get, to have an intimate relationship with Achashverosh, who was a guy. And that certainly comes under a law of Lo Tischatein Bam. So again, there was nobody actually saw the Ma'aseh Avera, but it was public knowledge. And that's considered Farhesia. And we said that for Farhesia, you have to give up your life on any of the mitzvahs, even on Shar mitzvahs, lav dafka on the big three. So how was Esther permitted to do so? V'lo masar nafsha lemisa. Yeharg val yava. This is the case of Farhesia. And the Gemara answers, Amar Abaye, Esther karka olam hay. So the famous answer of Abaye. And Rava says, Lanos atzmo shayin. So all the Rishonim, starting with Tosas, Divir Maskil V'ha, this long Tosas here on Ayin Daled Amud Beis, they all ask the same question. Why is the Gemara classifying Esther in her intimacy with Achashverosh as Shar Mitzvahs B'Farhesia? It's Gilui Arayos. If you assume Vayichal Alabas that Mordechai was married to Esther, so she was an Eishes Ish, this should be Gilui Arayos. So why didn't the Gemara say that she has to give up a life because of Gili Arayas? Why is the Gemara only bothered by Farhesia of Shar Mitzvahs? And Tosfos quotes the Rivam, "De kimle de mihai time the karka olam le'inyan de lo machayve limsar atzma mishum arayas." There was no doubt in the Gemara's mind that karka olam would be a mitigating circumstance as far as Gili Arayas is concerned. Why is that so? In Gili Arayas, there's no difference between the Boel and the Niveles. There's no difference between Kumvaseh and Shevi Altaseh, so that the factor of Karka Olam should not in any way be mitigating as far as Gili Arayas is concerned. So the Gemara says about V'kama Daf Lamed Beis, V'nichrasu Anafashos Ha'osos. With regard to Arayas, the Torah says Zachiv Kares for Nefashos Ha'osos. What's the plural of Ha'osos? And the Gemara says to include Ish v'Isha. They're both Chayav. And even if she was Shevi Altaseh, it's a complete Maisa Avera of Gili Arayas. So that if there's halacha because of the Chumras Avera of Gili Arayos, the halacha is Yeharig Val Yavar, that there's no pikuach nefesh of a chaybahem to override Gili Arayas because of the chumrah of Gili Arayas, as we saw derived from the Hekesh to Ritzicha, then why would Karka Olam be a factor here to mitigate against Gili Arayas? All right, it was Karka Olam, but v'nifrasu anafashos osos. So this Rivam remains very, very difficult, very challenging Rivam. And there are many other answers to the question that the Rishonim ask. Maybe this Gemara holds Esther was not married to Mordechai. Maybe a bias akum, even in the case of an Eishes Ish, does not qualify as Gili Arayas. All different answers. The Balamar, the Ramban, they all give their answers. But the Rivam is very difficult. Why does the Rivam assume that Karka Olam would be in any way a factor to allow Esther to have Gili Arayos with Achashverosh, such that the Gemara didn't even raise this issue of Esther Gili Arayos? Now, if you have a regular Gemara, then in the back of the Gemara you have the Rif, and on the Rif there's an Amuke Yosef in Masechet Sanhedrin. So you want to open up to Daf Yud Zayin Amid Beis in the Dapei Rif, and there's a paragraph in the Amuke Yosef that begins with the words Karka Olam. And the Amuke Yosef wants to explain why Abaye thinks that Karka Olam would have anything to do with the Chiyuv Mesiras Nefesh. And he says, Kol Hecha Sheyuchal La'aviro Bal Karcha. Do you remember this? That in certain cases, the Avera could be done against the will of the person who is being forced. And that person is being taken by the Ma'anes against his will. Sheyuchal Aviro Bal Karcha Lavar Avera. So even if the Jew would say, oh, I'm willing to give up my life, I don't want to violate this Avera, it's irrelevant. Because under certain circumstances and in certain scenarios, they could force the Avera, coerce the Avera upon the person. So afilu, even if he's ready, limsos nafsho, nevertheless, yochalu la'aviro bal karcho lavar savera. And then Ruki Yosef says that in such a case, where even if he decides he's willing to give up his life, they'll do the Avera anyway. So afilu yibsaras nafsho. Nevertheless, yuchlu lahaviro bal karcho lavaras Avera is then eno tzarech limsaras nafsho lihori. So again, follow the scenario here according to the Ruki Yosef. If he refuses, they'll kill him. But we're talking about a situation where he's not given any choice because they're going to do the Avera against his will, even if he refuses. But if he refuses, they'll kill him. Says the Ruki Yosef, in such a case, he or she actually, does not have to give up her life. That's called karka. Whole new pshat in karka. So karka really doesn't mean, well, are you doing this actively b'kuvaseh or passively b'shei b'alta? I said, no. That's not what karka means. Karka means that they could do the Avera against your will. They don't need you to comply and to agree or approve of the Avera in order to do the Avera. And now they give you a choice. Either you let us do the Avera, or if you refuse, we're going to knock your block, we'll kill you. Says the Ruki Yosef, in such a case, they don't have to give up their lives. If a person actively does an Avera in order to save his life, true, he's an onus, but he does have a Maisa Avera. He's afraid to die, and therefore he does the Maisa Avera. He might be potter from Onshim, but there is a chalosh shem Maisa Avera. The Ruki Yosef wants to suggest that there's another category of onus that's even more extreme, where he's not even doing a Maisa Avera. That's an onus without a Maisa Avera. And the nafkamina is the following. If it's an onus with a Maisa Avera, then he has to give up his life, and if he doesn't, it's very possible, gan shayach, that we will put him to death for the Maisa Avera. But then there's another category of ones where there's no Maisa Avera. They're going to do the Maisa, leave it to them. They'll fill in all the necessary blanks here. They'll do the Maisa Avera from A to Z against the will of the person. That's a whole different concept of onus. And that's an onus without a Maisa Avera. And then Ruki Yosef argues that that's what Abaye means when he says Esther Karka Olam, she did not have to give up her life because the Maisa Gilia Rice would have been done on her body against her will, Bal Karcha, without her agreeing. Again, if she would run away, there's no question that Achashverosh would have her beheaded. But she doesn't have to run away. Why not? Because it's a different category of onus. It's an onus without a Maisa Avera. So let's see if it's possible to use this Nebuchadnezzar Yosef as a springboard, as a background, to shed some light on the sheet of the Rivam. Let's go over the sheet of the Rivam. The Rivam was of the opinion that the Gemara never asked the question about Gilui Arayos. Esther Gilui Arayos was not even on the agenda. And why not? For a very simple reason. Because Esther's Karka Olam. So we asked the question, but V'nichlusu Anafashos also, so the Gemara Bava Kama Kuf Beis equates the Nevelis with the Boel. They're both Chayim. There's an Avera of Gilui Arayos. But perhaps we could suggest the following. The Gemara understood, according to the Rivam's Pshat in the Gemara, and it was a Dover Pashut, that as far as Gilui Arayos is concerned, we have here an onus of the most extreme category. Because as we said before, Achashverosh would do this action against her will, and that he has the capacity to do. And based on the logic of the Ruki Yosef, in such a case of an onus where there's no Ma'is Avera at all, there's no Yeharg Val Yava. And that was a Dover Pasha. What was the Gemara's Kasha? Avera B'farhesia, meaning Shar Averis B'farhesia. There the Chiyuv is Kiddush Hashem. We're not talking about the Avera of Gilui Arayos. The Gemara never raised the question of the Avera of Gilui Arayos. The Gemara had in its pocket a very simple answer to that question, that the status and the situation of Esther of Karka Olam would certainly remove Gilui Arayos. So we know Yeharg Val Yava, because it fits into that extreme category of ones where the Maisa could be done against her will. But what does bother the Gemara is Farhesia of Kiddush Hashem. Because as far as Kiddush Hashem, we're not measuring the Chumas Avera, we're not measuring the levels of Ones. Is it Ones with a Ma'is Avera? Could they have done it against her will? None of that is relevant. And comes along Abaye with a major breakthrough and a revolutionary Chiddush. And he says that Karka Olam would mitigate even in the case of Farhesia. She is not obligated to give up her life, even though it's for Farhesia. And that's because of Karka Olam. And Karka Olam, as we said before, in the light of the Nebuki Yosef, means that the Maisa could be done against her will, and therefore she doesn't have a Maisa Avera. That's an onus in the most extreme case, and that's enough to mitigate, says Abaye, even with regard to Farhesia and Kiddush Hashem. There is no mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem in the absence of a Maisa Avera, meaning in a situation, a scenario of the extreme onus of Karka Olam, where the Ma'anis could do the Maisa against her will in Gans. And you could begin to understand why Rava was not a happy camper. Because, as the Israelis say, Ma Pitaon, why should the Farhesia Kiddush Hashem be dependent upon whether or not it's this onus or that onus, whether or not she has a Ma'isa Avera, she's Karka Olam without a Ma'isa Avera? At the end of the day, she could have run away. She had the option of avoiding the marriage with Achashverosh. It would have cost her her life. But she did have that option. And if she didn't avail herself of that option, that's not Kiddush Hashem. Why not? Kiddush Hashem. Run away. Get out of this situation of being married and having a relationship with Achashverosh. Be willing to give up your life. And it's Farhesia. And therefore, says Rava, there would be Kiddush Hashem. Abaye's opinion is no. You can only have Kiddush Hashem when there's a Ma'is Avera. And the Machayev of Kiddush Hashem b'far Hesya, like the Machayev of Gili Arayas Mitzad Chumras Avera, will depend upon the two definitions and categories of onus. And in the category of onus, which is extreme, where there's no Maisa Avera, it's Karkaola, where they could have done the Maisa Mal Korcha, in such a case, there's no Chiv of Mesiris Nefesh, of Yehorig Val Yavar, neither B'Toras Gili Arayas, as one of the Averis Chamuros, and not even B'Toras Kiddush Hashem. Let's go back to our original distinction. Again, it's a long time ago, so it pays to review it, but it's very fundamental. Between Gimel Averos Chamuros and Shara Averos B'far Hesed. In Gimel Averos Chamuros, we said there's no V'chai B'hem. V'chai B'hem does not have the power to trump the Averos Chamuros. So we waive V'chai B'hem, put it in its little box, with regard to the Gimel Averos Chamuros. That's not the case with Shara Averos B'far Hesed. In Shara Averos B'far Hesed, we have V'chai B'hem. And Pikuach Nefesh would override the Avera, because the Avera is not Chamuro, it's Shara Averos. But the Farhesia generates a chiv of Kiddush Hashem. So whereas in Gimel Averos Chamuros, we're not talking about Kiddush Hashem. We're talking about the absence, or shall we say, the inefficacy of V'chai B'hem. V'chai B'hem is out the window. And basically, if not for V'chai B'hem, the Torah would say you're not allowed to violate the Torah on any of the Tariq mitzvahs. V'chai B'hem is a chiddush. Tells you that for the sake of life, you can violate the Torah, but up to a certain point. In Gila Raish, there's no V'chai B'hem. And if there's no V'chai B'hem, then you're left with the Isur, the Avera, and there's nothing to override and trump the Avera. But in Shara Averos, we have V'chai B'hem. Because Shara Averos are not Averos Chamuros, and V'chai B'hem applies, as it does to 610 out of 613. But we have the mitzvah of Iskadashtem, right? The B'toch B'nei Yisrael and Adas B'nei Yisrael, Eidah is Asara, and so forth and so on. Farhesi is Asara, and therefore there's a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. From a certain perspective, Ritzicha, kill him or we'll kill you, that becomes the paradigm of Averos Chamuros where there's no V'chai B'hem. Because how can you apply V'chai B'hem and kill someone else, take another Jew's life? What about his V'chai B'hem? Right. Good. So let's just review this. So now Maros is equated to Rotseach, and just like in Rotseach, there's no matir of V'chai B'hem, because the other person, the victim, has a V'chai B'hem of his own. so too in Amarasa, which is equated by analogy to Rotseach, the B'chai B'hem is suspended and there's no din of pikuach nefesh to be mat to the Avera. Or, I mean, you could say it a little bit different. You could say that B'chai B'hem and Gilui Arayos are sort of equal on the same level. Just like in Ritzicha, there's two B'chai B'hem. So therefore the Torah says Kiddush Hashem. The Kiddush Hashem is machriya, tips the scale in favor of Sheviatas. Do nothing, and if you have to die, you will die, and that's Kiddush Hashem. Now let's get to the issue of Avar V'lo Kiddush Hashem. Avar V'lo Nerag. So we mentioned the Ramach, if you recall, Rav Moshe Cohen, and he's of the opinion that in such a case, he's not called Ones. Because the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem tells us that he has to give up his life, and therefore there's no Ones. But in the case where he was afraid to die, but he had the Torah biblical commandment and obligation to give up his life, so the fear of death is not going to allow him to be considered an onus in the situation where the Torah says he has to die. That's the pele of the Ramach, that we completely ignore the category of onus when he did something not because he wanted to, but because he was afraid of death. But the Rambam, on the other hand, says that Avar V'lo Nerag, in the case of Kiddush Hashem, Eino Nenash, the Rambam says. Maybe the Rambam is saying that even in Gimel Averes Chaburos, we should apply V'chai B'hem. Again, we're not going to allow him to violate the Avera because of V'chai B'hem, because of Pikuach Nefesh, because that's equal to the Chiyuv of Kiddush Hashem. Right? Say the equal to the Avera, and then Kiddush Hashem tells us he has to give up his life, and he has to remain Shevi Altase. But Avar V'lo Nerag is Eino Nenash B'Bezdin. The Rambam says we can't punish him, and there is a Chalos Matir of Pikuach Nefesh. Okay, then, so that's where we'll stop for today. And Mirza Hashem will continue tomorrow.